Wait. An NHL insider just reported that the Toronto Maple Leafs, Dallas Stars, and Los Angeles Kings are leading the race for Mikko Rantanen. And here's the kicker. Because Chicago retained 50% of the salary and Carolina could retain another 50%, Toronto could potentially acquire one of the top 15 players in the NHL for only $2.3 million in cap hit, which sounds absolutely insane until you realize what they'd have to give up to make it happen. Folks, buckle up, because we might be witnessing the beginning of the biggest trade deadline bidding war in recent NHL history. Mikko Rantanen, the Finnish superstar who's been one of the most consistent point producers in hockey for the past 5 years, is reportedly available. And according to Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet, the Toronto Maple Leafs are one of 3 teams leading the pack to acquire him. This comes on the heels of reports that the Carolina Hurricanes have started actively shopping the 28-year-old winger after acquiring him from Colorado just weeks ago. And the most fascinating part of this entire situation is how the salary retention mechanics could make this financially feasible for cap-strapped contenders like Toronto. Let's break down every single angle of what could be the most consequential trade of the entire season. First, let's establish the timeline and context. Rantanen was traded from the Colorado Avalanche to the Carolina Hurricanes in late January in what was already a blockbuster move. At the time, Colorado was facing the same salary cap crunch we discussed earlier regarding Martin Necas. They couldn't afford to keep everyone with Cale Makar's massive extension looming, so they moved Rantanen to Carolina in what appeared to be a hockey trade that would help both teams. The Chicago Blackhawks served as a third-party facilitator in that deal, retaining 50% of Rantanen's salary to make the numbers work. Now, less than 2 months later, Carolina is reportedly shopping him. That's remarkable. Why would the Hurricanes acquire a player of Rantanen's caliber only to immediately start looking to move him? There are a few possibilities. Maybe the fit hasn't worked as expected. Maybe they realize they can flip him for an even bigger return than they gave up. Maybe Rantanen has indicated he doesn't want to stay in Carolina long term. Or maybe, and this is the most interesting possibility, Carolina is acting as a broker, acquiring Rantanen specifically to facilitate a larger trade to a team that Colorado couldn't directly deal with. Whatever the reason, Rantanen is available. And according to Elliot Friedman, 3 teams have emerged as frontrunners: the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Dallas Stars, and the Los Angeles Kings. Friedman specifically said the list of interested teams is scattered, but those that stood out were the Maple Leafs, Stars, and Kings. That's not casual speculation. That's reporting based on actual conversations Friedman has had with front office sources around the league. Now let's talk about Mikko Rantanen as a player, because if you're going to mortgage significant assets to acquire someone, you need to understand exactly what you're getting. Rantanen is legitimately elite. He's 28 years old, right in the prime of his career. Over the past 2 seasons, he's eclipsed 100 points each year. This season, despite the disruption of being traded mid-year, he's projected to finish with over 90 points, which would be his 4th consecutive season at that level. That's not just good, that's superstar-level consistency. Since joining Carolina, Rantanen has registered only 6 points in 12 games, which is admittedly below his usual standard. But that's hardly surprising given the adjustment period of joining a new team midseason, learning new systems, building chemistry with new line mates, and deal with the emotional disruption of being traded from the only NHL organization he'd ever known. Those 6 points in 12 games don't reflect his true ability. They reflect the challenges of in-season transitions. Any team acquiring Rantanen would be betting on his established track record, not a 12-game sample size with a new club. What makes Rantanen so valuable is his complete offensive skill set. He's a right-shot winger who can play on either flank. He's got elite vision and playmaking ability. He's a legitimate goal scorer who can finish from anywhere in the offensive zone. He's massive, 6'4", 215 pounds, which give him the size to win battles along the boards and protect the puck. He's excellent on the power play. He can kill penalties if needed, and he's been productive in the playoffs throughout his career. This is a player with virtually no weaknesses in his offensive game. Now here's where this gets absolutely fascinating from a Toronto perspective. The salary cap mechanics. Rantanen's actual contract carries a cap hit of $9.25 million per season through the end of next year. when he becomes an unrestricted free agent. That's a massive number that Toronto absolutely cannot absorb in their current cap situation. But remember, Chicago already retained 50% of that salary when he was traded to Carolina. That drops his cap hit to $4.63 million. Here's the game-changing part. Carolina still has retention slots available. If Toronto or any acquiring team can convince the Hurricanes to retain an additional 50% of Rantanen's already reduced salary, that would drop his cap hit down to just $2.3 million. Let me repeat that. $2.3 million for one of the 15 best players in the NHL. That's absurd. That's franchise-altering value if you can make it happen. At $2.3 million, Toronto absolutely has the cap space to add Rantanen. Even the tightest cap situations can accommodate that number. This is how teams like the Maple Leafs, who appear to have no financial flexibility, can suddenly become players for superstars at the deadline. Double salary retention is a salary cap hack that smart general managers exploit to acquire talent they otherwise couldn't afford. But, and this is critical, Carolina has to be willing to retain that additional salary. Why would they do that? Because the return they get from Toronto or Dallas or LA would be worth it. If you're Carolina and you're flipping Rantanen for a package of high-end prospects, multiple first-round picks, and roster players, taking on that salary retention is a cost of doing business. It's not ideal, but if the return is substantial enough, it's worth it. The report mentions that FanDuel Sportsbook has odds at plus 230 that Rantanen gets traded by the deadline. For those unfamiliar with betting odds, plus 230 means you win $230 for every $100 bet. That implies roughly a 30 to 35% chance that a trade happens. Given everything we're hearing, I'd say those odds might actually be undervaluing the likelihood of a deal. So, what would it cost Toronto to acquire Rantanen? Let's be realistic. It would be expensive. Extremely expensive. Carolina isn't going to just give away a superstar for mid-level assets. They're going to want premium prospects, high draft picks, and possibly roster players to balance the money. Based on similar trades in recent years, I'd estimate a package something like this. Easton Cowan, Toronto's top forward prospect. Fraser Minton, or another strong prospect, Toronto's 2026 first-round pick, a 2027 first-round pick, and possibly a roster player like Nick Robertson or Connor Dewar to balance out the cap implications. That's a massive haul, but that's what it takes to get a player of Rantanen's caliber. The question Brad Treliving has to answer is the same one we discussed with Philip Forsberg. Is this team in win-now mode where you're willing to sacrifice the future for a legitimate championship run? The case for going all in on Rantanen is compelling. Imagine a Maple Leafs forward group featuring Auston Matthews, William Nylander, John Tavares, and Mikko Rantanen as your top 6 offensive weapons. That's absolutely terrifying for opponents. That's the kind of firepower that can overwhelm any defense in a playoff series. Rantanen would also fit beautifully into Craig Berube's system. Despite his offensive prowess, he's not a one-dimensional player. He's responsible defensively, he's willing to battle physically, and he's proven he can elevate his game in big moments. Those are exactly the traits Berube values. Adding Rantanen wouldn't compromise the identity Berube is building. It would enhance it. The playoff implications are enormous. Toronto's perpetual Achilles heel has been playoff offense drying up when the games matter most. Adding Rantanen, a player who's been to the Stanley Cup final, who's scored big goals in big games, who's produced consistently in the postseason, directly addresses that weakness. He's scored clutch goals before. He knows how to perform under pressure. That experience and production is invaluable. But let's also acknowledge the risks, because they're substantial. First, you're trading away significant future assets for a player you'd only have for a few months as a rental. Rantanen becomes an unrestricted free agent this summer. Unless Toronto can negotiate a contract extension as part of the trade, which would require Rantanen's willingness and even more financial maneuvering, you're potentially giving up Easton Cowan and multiple first-round picks for a 3-month rental. If you don't win the Cup, that's a devastating outcome. Second, there's always injury risk. Hockey is a violent sport, and playoff hockey especially is brutal.